we were able to get this kind of result, where we actually sacrifice quality. Note, their fists aren't actually hitting each other when they're fighting, but that happens in action movies anyway. You don't actually notice in context down at the bottom. So we find it's actually better to maintain the pose than maintain where the hands and arms end up. So we actually compensate. We go from IK to FK when we transfer it. And that's how we can get the pose maintained, even if the punches aren't hitting. In terms of a crowd, a great big brawl, that's fine. You might have a couple in the front, but you don't really notice that in context. So another example of what we're doing is, we look at recasting without retargeting, and we look at that little inset right there, we notice the face looks pretty bad. Facial animation often has a hard time moving from one character to another. So we came up with heuristics to sort of fix that, basically offsets on the tongue or multipliers. And this was just done by trial and error, figuring out what sort of changes we need to make when we transfer the animation. And on the right, you can see actually some of the fatter characters would have intersections. So with retargeting, we would do things like bow out the arms a little bit for the fatter characters, and for characters with very oddly shaped heads, have offset and multipliers on some of the results. But note, we only would do constant offsets and multipliers. We never added new keyframes. This was just changing the existing ones. And that allowed animators to sort of recognize your animation and work with it much more easily. Another thing we did is actually very simple. It's called mirroring. You just flip left and right. Sounds silly, but you get a lot more variation. It gives you lefties and righties in your crowds rather than just one or another. And we could use that to get quite a bit more motion. Finally, we pose cache. The motion by pose cache, we convert it from an editable rig to just a geometry cache, like a lemon, or in our case, Titsy. And that's an example of a pose cache. Finally, we actually would run a simulation of the cloth and hair on that animation cycle. And we'll talk about later how we use that in the final shot. But all of these together, when we merge them, becomes our final clip of animation. So again, we have retargeting, mirroring for variation, pose caching, and simulation. All together in our final model clip. All right, so once we have that, we have to talk about how do we actually use that cross simulation. This is actually a very problematic issue. If we just take clips of animation and loop them, you'll notice there's a distinct pop. Every time Merida finishes jumping, see how our dress pops? That's because even if an animation clip cycles, there's no guarantee your cloth simulation will cycle. In general, physics does not loop. Physics is always different, always unique states. So what we end up doing is creating a system called simulation blending. Now, simulation blending is not sim per se, rather it's the blending of two simulation caches. Here's an example. Oops, sorry. Unnecessary animation. Here's a character that is transitioning from one clip to another. Notice the kilt pops midway through the animation. So I'm going to take the arrow and see if we can circle it. Right around here. There's a bit of a kilt pop. With simulation blending, there's a little bit of unnatural motion where it goes from one to another, but it roughly looks smooth. So that's the idea, is you blend or sort of crossfade between simulations.